On the Giza Plateau, not far from modern Cairo, a structure has stood for more than 4,000 years, one that humanity long believed it fully understood. The Great Pyramid of Pharaoh Khufu was seen as a symbol of the past, complete, frozen in time, and devoid of secrets. It inspired awe, attracted tourists, and became the subject of academic study. Yet it was precisely this confidence, the sense that everything important had already been discovered, that ultimately misled researchers. When European scholars of the modern era first began to systematically engage with the monuments of Egypt, they brought with them not only tools and methods, but also preconceived notions. Egypt appeared ancient but primitive. The Great Pyramid seemed monumental yet fundamentally simple, a tomb built through brute force and mass labor. This image proved so resilient that for decades it acted as a filter through which all evidence was interpreted. The earliest detailed investigations of the pyramid in the 19th century were conducted under conditions that today would be considered destructive. Explosions, broken walls, chaotic tunnels. Anything to gain rapid access to presumed treasures. When it became clear that the pyramid had long been looted, interest shifted from treasure hunting to documenting its internal structure. It was then that the main elements were recorded: the descending passage, the subterranean chamber, the ascending corridor, the grand gallery, the king's chamber, and the queen's chamber. This layout quickly became canonical. It entered textbooks, encyclopedias, and museum exhibits. The Pyramid of Khufu transformed into an architectural fact rather than a mystery. Anything that did not fit this scheme was either ignored or explained away as a construction flaw. Thus emerged a dangerous consensus. The pyramid had been studied sufficiently. Even then, however, attentive researchers noticed anomalies. The volume of the internal spaces appeared disproportionately small compared to the overall mass of the structure. Millions of tons of stone concealed only a few narrow corridors and chambers. A simple question arose: why build such a colossal structure for such modest interior space? There was no clear answer. Instead, a convenient explanation took hold: monumentality as a demonstration of power. The pharaoh was thought to have sought greatness through sheer scale rather than internal complexity. This idea fit neatly into a simplified view of ancient societies, where power was measured in stone and manpower. Yet this approach conflicted with what was known about the culture of the Old Kingdom. The Egyptians were not prone to meaningless excess. Their temples, tombs, and ritual complexes followed strict logic. Symbolism, mathematics, and religion were woven into a single system. If the Great Pyramid truly represented the pinnacle of their engineering thought, it could not be architecturally simplistic within. Over time, it became clear that the problem lay not with the pyramid, but with the methods used to study it. Archaeology for a long time was a science of what could be seen and touched. Everything hidden behind massive stone walls was considered either inaccessible or insignificant. The pyramid seemed to exploit this limitation, storing its secrets in places unreachable by traditional means. By the mid-20th century, interest in the pyramids began to wane. The major discoveries, it was believed, had already been made. Scholarly attention shifted to more promising sites: the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, temples, papyri. The Great Pyramid remained a symbol, but it ceased to be an active object of investigation. It was studied through old drawings, rarely questioned for their completeness. At the same time, another issue emerged, an institutional one. The history of ancient Egypt had crystallized into a relatively stable chronological model. Facts that did not fit were seen not as opportunities for revision, but as threats to the integrity of the system. The Pyramid of Khufu became a cornerstone of that model, and any doubt about its understood nature was treated with caution. The situation began to change only when researchers gained access to technologies that did not require damaging the monument. Computer modeling, laser scanning, and later methods based on particle physics made it possible to view the pyramid differently, not as a collection of rooms, but as a complex volume governed by internal logic. The first results were unsettling. They indicated anomalies in mass distribution, zones where stone density did not match expectations. These findings could not be explained by cracks or natural defects in the masonry. They suggested the presence of voids, spaces unknown to archaeologists and engineers alike. The scientific community reacted cautiously. Too much was at stake. To admit that the most studied pyramid in the world might conceal unknown structures meant acknowledging the limitations of decades of research. Still, the data continued to accumulate, and ignoring it became increasingly difficult. Gradually, it became evident that the Great Pyramid was not merely an ancient monument, but an object whose study had been prematurely concluded. It seemed to have been waiting for the moment when humanity would be ready to ask more complex questions, and possess the tools to seek answers. By the end of the 20th century, it was clear that the long-held confidence in the pyramid's complete understanding had been an illusion. Beneath its stone shell lay a structure whose purpose could not be reduced to burial alone. And it was then that a new phase of research began, one that transformed the Pyramid of Khufu from a symbol of the past into a source of uncomfortable yet unavoidable questions. Questions about who truly designed the pyramid's internal structure, why it contains elements never meant for human use, and what role is played by spaces that no one has ever entered. The answers lay deeper, within narrow shafts, hidden corridors, and voids yet to be fully understood. And the pyramid, it seemed, was in no hurry to reveal them. From the outside, the Great Pyramid appears deceptively simple. For triangular faces converge toward a single point, forming a shape so geometrically pure that it has come to symbolize perfection itself. For centuries, this external clarity shaped assumptions about the structure as a whole. If the exterior was simple, then the interior, so it was believed, must be equally straightforward. Yet this assumption collapses the moment one begins to examine the pyramid from within. Unlike later pyramids, the Pyramid of Khufu does not follow a standardized internal plan. There is no central axis running cleanly from entrance to burial chamber, no symmetrical arrangement of rooms, no repetition of architectural motifs. Instead, the interior appears fragmented, asymmetric, and, at times, deliberately confusing. Passages change direction unexpectedly. Corridors narrow and widen without obvious reason. Chambers are placed at different heights, breaking any sense of linear progression. The most striking feature is the vertical complexity. The pyramid is not organized horizontally, level by level, as one might expect from a massive stone structure. Instead, its internal spaces climb upward through the core of the monument. The descending passage leads deep into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, ending in an unfinished subterranean chamber. From there, a separate ascending passage branches upward, cutting sharply against gravity, eventually opening into the Grand Gallery, an immense, steeply sloped corridor unlike anything else in ancient architecture. The Grand Gallery alone challenges conventional explanations. Rising over 8 meters high and extending nearly 50 meters in length, it was constructed with extraordinary precision. Its corbelled walls rise inward at carefully calculated angles, redistributing weight away from the central passage. This is not the work of trial and error. It reflects a deep understanding of load management, geometry, and material behavior, knowledge that far exceeds what was once attributed to builders of the Old Kingdom. Yet the Grand Gallery leads not to a monumental hall, but to a relatively modest space, the King's Chamber. Compared to the colossal mass of stone surrounding it, the chamber feels almost restrained. Its walls are plain, its decoration absent. Above it, however, lie 5 separate relieving chambers, stacked stone spaces designed to divert the immense weight of the pyramid away from the chamber ceiling. These chambers, invisible to anyone inside the pyramid, represent one of the clearest indications that much of the structure was built to function unseen. This raises a fundamental question. Why invest such effort in spaces that were never meant to be accessed, admired, or even known to exist? Traditional explanations argue that these hidden features were purely structural. According to this view, the pyramid is essentially a massive pile of stone engineered to prevent collapse, and every void or chamber serves a mechanical purpose. But this explanation begins to falter when examined closely. The same civilization built other pyramids without resorting to such elaborate internal solutions. Simpler designs proved sufficient elsewhere. Why, then, did the Pyramid of Khufu require such architectural complexity? Further complicating matters is the so-called Queen's Chamber. Despite its name, there is no evidence that it ever housed a burial. It contains no sarcophagus, no inscriptions, No funerary equipment. Its ceiling is peaked rather than flat, a design choice that serves no obvious structural necessity. Even more puzzling are the narrow shafts extending from its walls, shafts that do not reach the exterior and were sealed deep within the pyramid. If the Queen's Chamber was abandoned during construction, as some suggest, its careful finish contradicts that idea. If it was a symbolic chamber, its placement and connections are unusually precise. And if it served a ritual function, then the scale and isolation of its associated shafts remain unexplained. What becomes increasingly clear is that the pyramid does not behave like a single-purpose structure. Its internal architecture suggests layers of intent, some visible, some hidden. Certain spaces appear designed for human use, passages wide enough to walk through, chambers accessible during construction or ritual. Others, however, were clearly not meant for people at all. Their dimensions, angles, and isolation suggest a different kind of function, one not tied to movement or occupation. The asymmetry of the internal layout further undermines the idea of simplicity. In most monumental architecture, symmetry reinforces order and meaning. The Great Pyramid rejects this principle internally. Its passages intersect at odd points. Its chambers do not align vertically. The overall plan seems intentionally non-intuitive, as though concealment itself were a design goal. This has led some researchers to propose that the pyramid was built in stages, with its internal plan evolving over time. Yet this theory struggles to explain the precision with which later elements integrate with earlier ones. The ascending passage, for example, connects seamlessly to the descending corridor, despite being carved upward through solid stone. Such integration would have required advanced planning from the outset. Others argue that the internal complexity reflects religious symbolism rather than engineering necessity. In this interpretation, the pyramid's architecture mirrors the journey of the soul through different realms: earth, underworld, sky. Changes in direction and elevation represent metaphysical transitions. While this idea aligns with known aspects of Egyptian belief, it does not fully account for the presence of sealed spaces and inaccessible voids. The deeper one looks, the harder it becomes to accept that the pyramid's interior is merely the byproduct of construction challenges. The architecture feels intentional in ways that resist purely practical explanations. It is as if the builders were encoding something into the structure itself, using space, absence, and concealment as tools. Modern architectural analysis reinforces this impression. Computer simulations of stress distribution reveal that certain voids and corridors are positioned with remarkable efficiency. Yet, alternative designs could have achieved the same results with fewer complexities. The choice to build this structure, in this way, suggests priorities beyond structural stability alone. In contrast to later pyramids, which simplify internal layouts and reduce hidden features, the Pyramid of Khufu stands alone. It represents a peak, not just of size, but of architectural ambition. After it, complexity decreases rather than increases. This reversal is difficult to explain within a linear model of technological progress. Why would a civilization reach such a high level of architectural sophistication, only to abandon it in subsequent generations? Why was this complexity never repeated? One possibility is that the knowledge required to design the Great Pyramid was rare, centralized, and perhaps deliberately restricted. If so, the pyramid becomes not just a monument, but a repository of specialized understanding, an understanding that may have been lost, forgotten, or intentionally concealed. By the end of this chapter, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. The internal architecture of the Great Pyramid cannot be dismissed as accidental or purely functional. It reflects a design philosophy that prioritizes hidden structure over visible form, internal logic over external explanation. And if the architecture itself defies precedent, then the elements concealed within it, narrow shafts, sealed passages, and unexplored voids, may represent something even more radical. Those elements, invisible for millennia, would soon force researchers to confront a troubling possibility: that parts of the pyramid were never intended to be entered, understood, or revealed at all. Among all the anomalies hidden inside the Great Pyramid, none have unsettled researchers quite like the narrow shafts extending from the Queen's Chamber. Unlike the main corridors and galleries, These features were never meant to be seen, let alone traversed. Their dimensions alone make that clear. Measuring barely 20 centimeters across, the shafts are far too small for a human body. Even a child could not crawl through them. From the moment they were discovered, they posed a disturbing question. Why construct passages that no person could ever use? For decades, the answer seemed obvious and reassuring. These were ventilation shafts, primitive ducts intended to allow air to circulate within the pyramid during construction or ritual use. The explanation was convenient, logical, and easy to accept. It required no revision of established theories and no reconsideration of the pyramid's purpose. And so it persisted largely unchallenged. Yet the shafts themselves quietly contradicted this interpretation. True ventilation channels would lead to the exterior. They would follow the shortest, most efficient path outward. The shafts from the king's chamber do, in fact, exit the pyramid. But those from the queen's chamber do not. They terminate deep within the structure, sealed behind stone. This alone should have ended the ventilation argument, but it did not. Instead, the inconsistency was ignored. The first serious attempt to investigate these shafts came only at the end of the 20th century, when robotic technology finally made it possible to explore spaces inaccessible to humans. In 1993, a small robotic device was introduced into the southern shaft of the Queen's chamber. Slowly, cautiously, it advanced through the narrow passage, transmitting grainy images back to the surface. What it encountered changed everything. After traveling approximately 60 meters, the robot reached a perfectly cut limestone block. Embedded in the stone were two small copper fittings, symmetrical and deliberate. They were not structural reinforcements. They were not random inclusions. They resembled handles. A door. The discovery sent shockwaves through the archaeological community. Ventilation shafts do not end in doors, and they certainly do not require copper components, materials of value, carefully shaped and positioned. The implication was unavoidable. This shaft was designed to be closed. For years, the stone block became known as the Gantenbrink door, named after the engineer who led the project. Debate erupted almost immediately. Some researchers argued that the copper pieces were purely symbolic, never intended to function. Others suggested they were part of a locking mechanism. But no explanation could reconcile the presence of a sealed door with the idea of a purely functional shaft. The mystery deepened when permission was eventually granted to drill a small hole through the block. A second robot inserted a camera through the opening. On the other side lay a small cavity, bare, silent, and unfinished. But at its far end, another stone block was visible. Another door. The realization was deeply unsettling. This was not a single obstruction, but a system, a sequence of barriers placed one behind the other. Whatever lay beyond was meant to remain inaccessible, not just difficult to reach, but deliberately hidden. Further exploration of the northern shaft revealed similar features. Although its layout differed slightly, it too contained sealed elements, carefully positioned and inaccessible. The consistency suggested planning, not improvisation. These shafts were not afterthoughts. They were integral to the pyramid's design. At this point, the question was no longer what these shafts were, but why they existed at all. One hypothesis proposed that the shafts were symbolic pathways for the soul of the pharaoh. In ancient Egyptian belief, the king's spirit was destined to ascend to the heavens, joining the gods among the stars. The orientation of the shafts appeared to support this idea. When traced backward, their angles aligned with regions of the sky associated with important celestial bodies, such as Orion and Sirius, both deeply significant in funerary theology. Yet symbolism alone could not explain the doors. If the shafts were metaphysical routes, why block them? Why create a journey for the soul only to interrupt it with stone barriers? And why use copper, an earthly, valuable material, in something intended purely for the spiritual realm? Another interpretation suggested that the shafts were never meant to lead anywhere, but to conceal something. In this view, the doors were not symbolic endpoints but protective seals. They guarded spaces or objects deemed too important or too dangerous to be accessed. This idea, once dismissed as speculative, gained traction as more data emerged. Crucially, No ancient text describes these shafts or their purpose. The pyramid texts, inscribed in later pyramids, speak extensively about the soul's ascent, the sky, and divine transformation. But they are silent on sealed passages, hidden doors, or inaccessible chambers. This silence is striking. It suggests that whatever these shafts represented, they were not meant to be explained openly. Equally troubling is the precision with which the shafts were constructed. Their angles are consistent, their walls smooth, their alignment exact. They were not carved hastily or approximately. Each deviation appears intentional. This level of care implies that the shafts were as important as the main chambers, perhaps even more so. Some researchers have proposed that the shafts served as part of a larger, now-lost system. Not merely symbolic, not merely structural, but functional in a way that has yet to be understood. The idea is controversial, but difficult to dismiss outright. The pyramid already demonstrates an advanced understanding of stress distribution, geometry, and material behavior. To assume that its builders would not experiment with unseen internal systems may underestimate their capabilities. What remains undeniable is this: the shafts were not designed for humans. Their size, their ceiling, and their isolation all point to a purpose beyond physical access. They were meant to exist unseen, known only to their builders, and perhaps not even to all of them. As investigations stalled due to political, ethical, and conservation concerns, the shafts became symbols of a larger problem. The pyramid was revealing features that did not fit established categories. They were neither ritual spaces nor engineering necessities. They occupied a gray zone where interpretation faltered. By the early 21st century, it was clear that the shafts represented a threshold in understanding. To continue treating the pyramid as a simple tomb was no longer tenable. Something more complex was embedded within its stone. Something encoded in narrow passages and sealed behind doors no one was meant to open. And beyond those doors lay silence. But that silence would not last forever. Because even as researchers debated the meaning of the shafts, new technology was already preparing to expose something far more disturbing. An immense hidden space, invisible, inaccessible, and utterly unexpected. That discovery would force science to confront the pyramid in an entirely new way. For decades, the hidden shafts of the Queen's Chamber stood as the most unsettling mystery inside the Great Pyramid. They were small, precise, sealed, and inexplicable, but still limited in scale. Researchers could debate symbolism, ritual, or unknown functions without fundamentally challenging the overall understanding of the monument. That fragile balance collapsed in the second decade of the 21st century, when the pyramid revealed something far more disruptive. This time, the discovery did not come from tunnels, drills, or robots. It came from physics. The project that would change everything began quietly. An international team of scientists, engineers, and archaeologists launched an initiative to study the Great Pyramid using muon tomography, a technique originally developed for particle physics. Muons are subatomic particles created when cosmic rays strike Earth's atmosphere. They constantly rain down from the sky, passing through solid matter almost effortlessly. Crucially, they behave differently depending on the density of the material they pass through. By measuring how many muons penetrate a structure from different angles, scientists can create a three-dimensional map of its internal density. In other words, the pyramid could be scanned without touching a single stone. At first, expectations were modest. The technique was meant to confirm existing models, refine measurements, perhaps detect small voids or inconsistencies in the masonry. Few believed it would reveal anything fundamentally new. After all, this was the most studied building in human history. The first datasets seemed unremarkable. Known chambers appeared exactly where they were supposed to be. The Grand Gallery registered clearly, as did the King's Chamber and its relieving spaces. The scans reassured skeptics. The method worked. Then something unexpected appeared. Above the Grand Gallery, in a region long assumed to be solid stone, the data showed a massive anomaly. A zone where muons passed through far more easily than they should have. At first, researchers suspected an error, instrument drift, miscalculation, background interference. The analysis was repeated. then repeated again using different detectors placed at different locations inside and outside the pyramid. The anomaly persisted. As the data were refined, the shape of the void began to emerge. It was not a crack, not a fissure, not a random cavity. It was enormous, at least 30 meters long, with a cross-section comparable to the Grand Gallery itself. Its geometry was too regular to be accidental. Its position was too central to be ignored. It was quickly labeled the Great Void. The name was deliberately neutral. No one wanted to speculate prematurely. But inside the scientific community, the implications were immediately understood. This was not a minor architectural detail. It was the largest hidden space ever detected inside the Great Pyramid, and it had never been documented, hypothesized, or even suspected. Most unsettling of all, there was no known access to it. No corridor led to the void. No shaft connected to it. It existed as a sealed volume, entombed within millions of tons of stone, invisible to every previous method of exploration. For over 4,000 years, it had remained untouched. The immediate question was unavoidable. Why was it built? Structural explanations were the first line of defense. Some engineers argued that the void functioned as a stress relief feature, redistributing weight above the Grand Gallery. On the surface, the idea seemed plausible. After all, the pyramid's immense mass required careful management. But as analyses continued, cracks appeared in this explanation. The shape of the void did not match known stress relief designs. It was too long, too regular, too deliberately positioned. If the builders merely wanted to reduce pressure, simpler solutions existed and were used elsewhere in the pyramid. The 5 relieving chambers above the king's chamber, for example, achieved their purpose efficiently without creating vast empty spaces. Why then create a second, even larger void? Equally problematic was the void's orientation. It ran parallel to the Grand Gallery as if echoing it. This alignment felt intentional, almost symbolic. It suggested planning rather than improvisation. The void was not a byproduct of construction. It was part of the original blueprint. As news of the discovery spread, reactions varied sharply. Some hailed it as one of the greatest archaeological findings of the century. Others urged restraint, warning against sensationalism. A few dismissed it outright, arguing that without physical access, the void's significance could not be assessed. But denial became increasingly difficult. Independent teams confirmed the findings. Additional muon detectors reinforced the data. The void was real, massive, and unexplained. What troubled researchers most was not merely its existence, but its redundancy. The pyramid already contained a grand internal feature, the Grand Gallery itself. Why replicate such a space invisibly, where no human could walk, see, or use it? This redundancy challenged the assumption that every element of the pyramid served an obvious purpose. It hinted at a different design philosophy, one in which hidden spaces mattered as much as visible ones, if not more. Speculation inevitably followed. Some proposed that the void concealed a chamber of immense importance, perhaps a symbolic heart of the pyramid, or a space intended for rituals never recorded. Others suggested it might contain objects, texts, or structures deliberately sealed away. A minority even questioned whether it was meant to be empty at all. Officially, no such claims were endorsed. The project leaders were careful, emphasizing that the void's contents, if any, were unknown. But behind closed doors, the debates were intense. The void refused to fit neatly into any existing category. Compounding the mystery was the response of authorities. Despite the magnitude of the discovery, permission to physically investigate the void was not granted. No drilling, no microrobots, no endoscopic probes. The justification was preservation, the risk of damaging an irreplaceable monument. Yet critics pointed out an uncomfortable truth. The pyramid had already been drilled, blasted, and tunneled in the past, often with far less justification. Why now, when the stakes were highest, was access denied? Some suggested that opening the void might force a reevaluation of long-held narratives about the pyramid's purpose. Others worried about public reaction. The idea that the Great Pyramid still contained a massive unknown space unsettled not just archaeologists, but the broader story humanity tells itself about its past. As months turned into years, the Great Void became a symbol of scientific frustration. It was detected, measured, and modeled, but not entered. It existed in a liminal state, halfway between discovery and ignorance. The pyramid had spoken, but only partially, and in doing so, it delivered a quiet but devastating message. Humanity does not yet understand this monument. The Great Pyramid was no longer merely ancient. It was unfinished. Unfinished in the sense that its story had not been fully told. The void above the Grand Gallery stood as a silent challenge, a reminder that even the most familiar symbols can still conceal profound unknowns. The shock was not just archaeological. It was philosophical. If such a space could exist undetected for millennia, what else might remain hidden? And more disturbingly, were these hidden spaces ever meant to be found at all? Those questions would soon lead researchers beyond engineering and physics into far more controversial territory. Belief, cosmology, and forbidden knowledge. That journey begins in the next chapter. When engineering explanations began to falter, attention inevitably shifted toward belief. For the ancient Egyptians, religion was not a separate sphere of life. It was the framework through which reality itself was understood. Architecture, astronomy, ritual, and kingship were inseparable. To build was to perform a sacred act. To align stone was to align the cosmos. If the Great Pyramid resisted mechanical interpretation, perhaps it spoke the language of theology instead. The funerary texts of the Old Kingdom describe death not as an end, but as a transformation. The king did not simply die, he ascended. His spirit was expected to rise from the earth and take its place among the imperishable stars. This journey was not metaphorical. It was mapped, structured, and governed by strict rules. The sky was a destination, and the pyramid was the vehicle. In this context, the narrow shafts extending from the queen's and king's chambers took on new meaning. Their orientation was not arbitrary. When projected outward, their angles corresponded closely with regions of the sky that held immense symbolic importance. The southern shaft of the king's chamber pointed toward the belt of Orion, a constellation associated with Osiris, lord of the afterlife. The northern shaft aligned with the circumpolar stars, those that never set, seen as eternal and unchanging. To the Egyptian mind, these alignments were not poetic gestures. They were functional connections. The pyramid, in this interpretation, acted as a bridge between earth and sky, guiding the king's essence toward divine realms. The shafts were not meant to be walked through. They were conduits, paths defined by direction rather than distance. Yet this elegant cosmological model immediately encountered a problem. The doors. If the shafts were routes for the spirit, why block them with stone barriers? Why insert copper fittings, materials tied to craft and value, into passages meant for the immaterial? Symbolism alone could not account for obstruction. A path meant to be traversed by a soul would not logically end in a sealed wall. The Great Void intensified this contradiction. Its scale dwarfed any purely symbolic chamber. No religious text describes a 30-meter hidden space hovering above a gallery. No ritual required such volume. The void's existence suggested something beyond standard funerary belief, something closer to intentional concealment. This is where the concept of restricted knowledge enters the discussion. Ancient Egypt was not an open society in terms of information. Sacred knowledge was compartmentalized. Priests were initiated in stages, gaining access to deeper truths only after years of training. Certain texts were reserved for specific rituals. Others were never written down at all, passed orally or encoded symbolically. Knowledge in this system was power, and power was carefully guarded. Some scholars argue that the Great Pyramid reflects this hierarchy. Its visible spaces, the corridors and chambers accessible during construction, represent the public face of belief. Its hidden features, the sealed shafts and inaccessible voids, belong to a deeper stratum, intended only for a select few, or perhaps for no one at all. In this view, the pyramid was not merely a tomb but a repository, not of objects but of principles, geometry, astronomy, and theology merged into a single structure designed to preserve a worldview. The concealment of certain spaces ensured that this worldview could not be easily altered, misused, or misunderstood. The absence of inscriptions inside the pyramid supports this idea. Unlike later tombs, which are covered in hieroglyphs, the Great Pyramid is largely silent. Its walls do not explain themselves. They do not instruct or narrate. Meaning is carried by form, orientation, and proportion, not by text. This silence may be deliberate. Written language can be copied, translated, corrupted. Architecture, by contrast, endures. A stone alignment remains meaningful even when its original context is forgotten. The builders of the pyramid may have chosen stone over script precisely because it resists reinterpretation. The Great Void, then, could represent a deliberate gap, a space whose purpose is defined by absence. It may have been intended as a buffer between the human world and something beyond it, or as a safeguard, ensuring that certain alignments or resonances were preserved without interference. More controversial theories push this idea further. They suggest that the pyramid functioned as a kind of instrument, one that interacted with natural forces in ways not yet fully understood. Sound, vibration, resonance, and even electromagnetic effects have all been proposed as possible factors. While such ideas remain speculative, they share a common premise. The pyramid was designed to do something, not merely to contain something. Within this framework, the sealed doors and hidden voids are not failures of access but features of control. They regulate interaction. They prevent intrusion. They preserve conditions. What is striking is how carefully these features were concealed. The shafts are invisible from the outside. The void leaves no surface trace. Even the relieving chambers above the king's chamber were discovered only by accident. This level of concealment suggests intentional secrecy rather than oversight. And yet, despite all this complexity, the pyramid does not advertise its mystery, presents itself as simple, even austere. The contrast between its exterior clarity and interior opacity is profound. It invites observation while resisting understanding. As researchers grappled with these implications, a troubling thought emerged. Perhaps the pyramid was never meant to be fully deciphered. Perhaps it was designed to operate across millennia, outlasting the cultural framework that created it. In that case, confusion and debate would not be signs of failure, but evidence of success. The Great Pyramid may not encode answers so much as constraints. It limits interpretation. It channels inquiry. It forces those who study it to confront the boundaries of their assumptions. Religion, astronomy, and secrecy converge within its stone, not as separate layers but as a unified system, one that does not reveal itself easily or completely. And this realization leads to an even more uncomfortable question. If certain knowledge was deliberately embedded and hidden within the pyramid, who was it meant to be hidden from? The living, the future, or humanity itself? That question brings the story to its most sensitive point, one that lies not in the past, but in the present. Because the greatest mystery of the Great Pyramid may no longer be what the ancient builders intended, but why, even today, we are still not allowed to find out. By the time the Great Void was confirmed, the question had shifted. It was no longer what existed inside the Great Pyramid, but why it remained inaccessible. The monument had survived earthquakes, looting, and centuries of intrusive exploration. Walls had been broken, passages forced open, chambers breached. Yet the most significant hidden spaces, the sealed shafts and the Great Void, remained untouched. Not by accident, but by a pattern that seemed to repeat across millennia. In antiquity, access to the pyramid was tightly controlled. Construction itself was a state project, overseen by elite administrators and priestly specialists. Knowledge was distributed hierarchically. Those who quarried stone did not necessarily understand the plan. Those who understood the plan did not necessarily perform the labor. This compartmentalization ensured efficiency and secrecy. When construction ended, entrances were sealed, casing stones smoothed, and the monument presented to the world as a perfect geometric form with no obvious vulnerabilities. Tomb robbers eventually penetrated the pyramid, But even their incursions tell a story of limits. They followed the most likely routes, driven by experience and intuition, not by blueprints. Their tunnels intersected known corridors and chambers, not the narrow shafts or the great void. Looters sought goods, not principles, gold, not geometry. The hidden architecture lay outside their interests and their reach. More revealing is what did not happen. No ancient text records a sanctioned reopening of the pyramid's sealed systems. No ritual manual instructs priests to access hidden chambers. No inscription boasts of secret knowledge recovered from within. The silence is conspicuous. It suggests that, once sealed, the pyramid was meant to remain closed, not merely to protect a body, but to preserve a condition. In the modern era, the reasons changed, but the outcome remained the same. As Egyptology professionalized in the 20th century, preservation replaced exploration as the guiding principle. The Great Pyramid became not just a subject of study, but a national symbol and a global heritage site. With that status came restrictions. Drilling, cutting, or forcing access into newly detected spaces was no longer a matter of curiosity. It was a political and ethical decision. Officially, the argument is conservation. Any invasive action risks destabilizing a structure that has stood for 45 centuries. Microfractures could propagate. Unknown load paths could be compromised. In this view, restraint is responsibility. Yet critics point out a contradiction. The pyramid has already endured far more aggressive interventions. Explosions in the 19th century, heavy tunneling, and structural intrusions carried out with little understanding of consequences. If those acts did not collapse the monument, why would carefully controlled, minimally invasive exploration now be unacceptable? The answer may lie beyond engineering. The Great Void poses a narrative problem. Its existence alone undermines the long-standing portrayal of the pyramid as a simple royal tomb. Opening it, whatever the outcome, would force interpretation. An empty void would raise as many questions as a filled chamber. Either result would demand revisions to textbooks, museums, and public understanding. There is also the issue of expectation. The pyramid occupies a unique place in human imagination. Any discovery inside it would be magnified, sensationalized, and contested. Authorities must weigh not only scientific value, but cultural impact. In this sense, not knowing becomes a form of control. Some researchers argue that the true barrier is methodological. Modern science excels at measurement and modeling, but struggles with intent. It can describe dimensions and densities, but it cannot easily explain why ancient builders chose one configuration over another when multiple solutions were available. Entering the void would provide data, but not necessarily meaning. The risk, then, is not physical damage but interpretive failure. And yet, this caution echoes something older. The architecture itself seems to anticipate restraint. The shafts are too small. The doors are sealed. The void has no access point. These are not accidents of design. They are features that resist entry. The pyramid does not invite exploration. It tolerates observation. It offers glimpses, not pathways. This raises a provocative possibility that the pyramid was designed to be understood indirectly, through alignment, proportion, and relationship, not through physical occupation. In that case, forcing entry would miss the point entirely. The message, if there is one, lies in the structure as a whole, not in a hidden chamber at its center. The builders may have assumed that future generations would be tempted to open what was sealed. They may also have anticipated that doing so would yield little clarity. A void can be as communicative as a chamber. An absence can be a boundary. Today, the Great Pyramid exists at the intersection of science, heritage, and restraint. Technology has given us the ability to see what lies within, but not the authority to touch it. Whether this balance will hold remains uncertain. Advances in microrobotics and non-invasive probes continue. Pressure to explore grows with each new generation of researchers. But for now, the pyramid remains consistent with itself. It stands as it always has, outwardly simple, inwardly complex, selectively silent. Its most important spaces remain untouched, not because they are unknown, but because they are unentered. Perhaps that is the final lesson of the Great Pyramid. Not that ancient builders hid something we have yet to find, but that they built something that does not yield meaning through intrusion. A structure that rewards patience over force, inference over access. In the end, the greatest mystery may not be what lies behind the sealed doors or within the Great Void. By the beginning of the 21st century, the Great Pyramid had quietly crossed an invisible line. It was no longer viewed solely as an archaeological object, nor even as a religious monument. Increasingly, it was understood as a system, one that continued to function long after the civilization that created it had vanished. And like any system, it appeared to impose rules on how it could be approached. Every major discovery inside the pyramid had followed the same pattern. First came certainty, the belief that nothing fundamentally new remained to be found. Then came contradiction, shafts without exits, doors without keys, voids without access. And finally, restraint. Each time humanity approached the threshold of deeper intrusion, something stopped it. Sometimes technology was insufficient. Sometimes permission was denied. Sometimes interpretation itself broke down. This recurring pattern led some researchers to an unsettling idea. Perhaps the pyramid was never meant to be opened further. The traditional archaeological mindset assumes that monuments are puzzles designed to be solved. Chambers exist to be entered. Doors exist to be opened. Voids exist to be filled with meaning once accessed. The Great Pyramid challenges that assumption. Its most enigmatic features are defined not by what they reveal, but by what they withhold. The Great Void is the clearest example. It is not hidden by accident. It is not blocked by collapse or erosion. It has no doorway, no corridor, no practical interface. It exists as a volume without invitation. To reach it, one would have to violate the structure, to drill, cut, or force an opening. In doing so, the very act of discovery would destroy the integrity of what is being studied. This paradox has led some theorists to propose that the pyramid operates as a filter. It allows observation but resists penetration. It rewards analysis but punishes intrusion. Its knowledge, if it can be called that, is encoded spatially rather than materially. Understanding comes not from entering its hidden spaces, but from recognizing their placement, proportion, and relationship to the whole. From this perspective, the sealed shafts and voids are not containers. They are signals. The pyramid communicates through absence. A blocked passage draws attention to direction rather than destination. A void draws attention to structure rather than contents. The message is not behind the door, it is the door. This idea finds indirect support in ancient Egyptian philosophy. Sacred texts repeatedly emphasize balance, order, and restraint. Knowledge was not meant to be consumed indiscriminately. Certain truths were considered dangerous if accessed prematurely or without preparation. Initiation was a process, not an event. Some doors, once opened, could not be closed again. If the Great Pyramid was conceived within this intellectual framework, then its architecture begins to make a different kind of sense. It is not a riddle with a final answer, but a boundary marker. It delineates what can be known from what must be inferred. It invites contemplation rather than conquest. Modern technology, ironically, reinforces this interpretation. The more precisely scientists map the pyramid, the clearer its internal logic becomes, and the less necessary physical entry appears. Digital reconstructions reveal relationships invisible to the naked eye. Alignments, ratios, and voids form patterns that can be studied without disturbing a single stone. In this sense, the pyramid seems unusually compatible with the future. It resists brute force exploration, but accommodates non-invasive analysis. It does not yield to drills, but responds to particles, mathematics, and light. It is as if its builders anticipated a time when knowledge would advance without destruction. This raises a profound possibility. The Great Pyramid may be the earliest example of long-term informational architecture, a structure designed not just to survive millennia, but to regulate how future civilizations interact with it. If so, then the failure to open its deepest spaces is not a limitation of modern science. It is a feature of the design. Each generation approaches the pyramid believing it will finally solve it. Each generation leaves with more data, more precision, and more questions. The pyramid does not close the conversation, it sustains it. Seen this way, the Great Pyramid becomes less of a monument to death and more of a monument to continuity. It does not belong entirely to the past, nor does it fully belong to the present. It exists in a slow dialogue with time itself. Perhaps the builders understood something fundamental, that civilizations change faster than questions do, that answers decay, but structure endures, that meaning, once fully revealed, loses its power, but meaning approached asymptotically can last forever. The sealed doors may never be opened. The great void may remain empty or unknown indefinitely. And that may be exactly the point. The Great Pyramid does not demand to be entered. It demands to be considered. And as long as it stands on the Giza Plateau, casting its shadow across centuries of inquiry, it will continue to do what it has always done best. Not tell humanity what to think, but remind it how much it does not yet understand.